In the crisp dawn of a New Hampshire spring where mist clings to the ancient pines of the White Mountains, State Trooper Thomas Owens, what began as a routine morning patrol evolved into something unexpected. A bobcat tried to cross Route 302 with her cubs when a mother bobcat abandoned her weakest kitten by the roadside. Owens faced a profound choice to intervene or let nature run its harsh course. His decision not only changed the fate of two fragile bobcat kittens struggling to survive, but also reignited a sense of purpose long buried within himself. But this was just the beginning. What Thomas found in those woods the next day would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any news stories. The morning had dawned crisp and clear over the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the kind of spring day that made Thomas Owens grateful for his job as a state trooper. There was something about patrolling these winding roads, surrounded by ancient forests and breathtaking vistas, that brought him peace. At 52, with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines etched around his eyes, Trooper Owens had seen just about everything in his 30 years of service, or so he thought. The radio crackled to life, breaking the comfortable silence in his cruiser. Dispatched to 243, we've got reports of a wildlife situation on Route 302 near the Mount Washington Hotel. Some kind of wildat trying to cross with young. Several near misses reported. Can you check it out? Thomas adjusted his hat and reached for the radio. This is 243. I'm about 5 minutes out on my way. As a lifelong resident of Carroll, New Hampshire, Thomas knew the area's wildlife better than most. Bobcats were elusive creatures rarely spotted by humans, let alone causing traffic situations. Something unusual must be happening. His mind wandered to his late wife, Margaret, as he navigated the curves toward Breton Woods. She'd been gone 3 years now, but her love for animals remained a constant presence in his life. Every creature has a story, she used to say. We just need to be quiet enough to hear it. The stately white facade of the Mount Washington Hotel came into view, and just beyond it, Thomas spotted the commotion. Several cars had pulled to the shoulder, and a small crowd had gathered, pointing toward the tree. And Thomas parked his cruiser, flipped on his emergency lights, and stepped out. Folks, please get back in your vehicles, he called, approaching the scene. What's going on here? A middle-aged woman in hiking gear stepped forward. Officer, there's a bobcat with kittens trying to cross. She's been at it for almost 20 minutes. One of the little ones seems to be struggling. Thomas followed her gesture and spotted the animals. The mother bobcat stood at the edge of the forest, her tawny coat dappled with shadows, ears erect and alert. Behind her, 4 tiny kittens huddled together, their spotted fur blending with the forest floor. The scene might have been heartwarming if not for the obvious distress of the mother and the concerning weakness of one of the kittens. I need everyone to clear the area, Thomas announced, his voice firm but kind. Give them space, I'll handle traffic control. As the onlookers reluctantly dispersed, Thomas radioed for backup to help manage the road. Then he positioned his cruiser to block one lane and stood ready to halt traffic from the other direction when necessary. For the next half hour, Thomas watched the mother bobcat's determined efforts. She would pick up one kitten by the scruff of its neck, carry it across the road, deposit it in the underbrush on the other side, then return for the next. The first 3 crossings went smoothly, but when she attempted to move the 4th kitten, noticeably smaller than its siblings, the little one struggled in her grasp. Twice the mother had to set the kitten down mid-crossing when it squirmed too much. Thomas felt his heart constrict as he watched the mother bobcat's movements were becoming increasingly frantic, her golden eyes darting between the struggling kitten and her 3 offspring already waiting across the road. Come on, little one, Thomas murmured under his breath. You can do it. But on the 3rd attempt, the kitten barely moved when its mother nudged it with her nose. Even from a distance, Thomas could see it was breathing rapidly, its tiny sides heaving with the effort. What happened next would haunt Thomas for days. After several more attempts to rouse the weakening kitten, the mother bobcat made a sound, something between a growl and a cry, then turned and trotted. Across the road to where her other 3 kittens waited, she paused once looking back at the abandoned kitten before leading her remaining offspring deeper into the forest. "Well, be damned," Thomas whispered, removing his hat. He'd heard about this. Wildlife sometimes abandoned the weakest of their young when survival was at stake, but witnessing it firsthand was different. The abandoned kitten lay still by the roadside, occasionally moving its head, but clearly too weak to follow. Thomas knew the protocol nature should take its course. Wild animals weren't pets. Intervention often did more harm than good. But as he watched the tiny creature struggle, Margaret's voice echoed in his mind. Every creature deserves a chance, Tom, even the smallest ones, especially the smallest ones. Before he could talk himself out of it, Thomas radio dispatch. "This is 243. I've got an abandoned bobcat kitten here, appears to be in distress. Going to need contact information for fish and game and possibly a wildlife rehabilitator. Copy that. 243. I'll make those calls. Stand by." While waiting for further instructions, Thomas approached the kitten cautiously. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Its eyes open but glazed, its spotted coat dull. Removing his jacket, Thomas carefully scooped up the tiny animal, which offered no resistance. "A worrying sign. Hang in there, little guy," he murmured, cradling the bundle against his chest. The kitten was lighter than he expected, barely the weight of a softball. When his radio crackled again, the dispatcher informed him that a fish and game officer was en route and had contacted a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. "They say to keep the animal warm and minimize handling." And Thomas, they said this was the right call. Relief washed over him within 15 minutes. Jane Martinez from New Hampshire Fish and Game arrived. Her department truck pulling up behind Thomas's cruiser. Well, she said, approaching with a small animal carrier. When dispatch said Trooper Owens had a bobcat situation, I figured it had to be something unusual. You've got quite the reputation for wildlife encounters." Thomas managed a smile. He and Jane had worked together before most recently when a moose had wandered into the town center last fall. This one's different. Jane, mother abandoned. It couldn't bear to leave it. Jane peered at the bundle in Thomas's jacket. Female, probably 3 or 4 weeks old, significantly underweight. She gently transferred the kitten to the carrier. "Good thing you called. She wouldn't have made it out here alone. Will she survive?" Thomas asked the question, catching in his throat Jane's expression. "Soft and hard to say. Linda at the rehab center works miracles, but this little one's pretty weak. I'll take her straight there." Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of how invested he'd become in the tiny creature's fate. "Keep me posted. You got a trooper." As Jane drove away with the precious cargo, Thomas remained standing by the roadside for a long moment, staring into the forest where the mother bobcat had disappeared with her other kittens. Something about the day's events had stirred emotions he'd kept carefully buried since Margaret's passing. The remainder of his shift passed in a blur. By evening, when Thomas finally pulled into the driveway of his modest lakeside home, exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. Inside the house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to Margaret's father. Thomas fed his aging golden retriever Solomon and collapsed into his favorite armchair. Still in uniform, he must have dozed off because the ringing of his phone startled him. Awake, it was Jane. "Thomas, the kitten stabilized for now. Linda's got her on fluids, and she's responding well. Thought you'd want to know that's great news." Thomas replied, relief evident in his voice. "Thanks for calling. There's something else." Jane continued, her tone changing slightly. "Linda found something unusual during her examination. This kitten has traces of a particular antibiotic in her system, one that's sometimes used to treat wildlife and manage studies. There's a research team from UNH that's been tracking a female bobcat in that area for the past year." Thomas sat up straighter. "You think this is their bobcat?" "It's possible they've been monitoring her since before she would have conceived these kittens. Linda's reaching out to them now. If it is their research subject, they might have additional information that could help with rehabilitation." After hanging up, Thomas found himself unable to return to sleep. Instead, he brewed a pot of coffee and Sat on his back porch, gazing out at the moonlit Lake Solomon settled at his feet with a contented sigh. "What do you think, old boy?" Thomas murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Did I do the right thing today?" Solomon looked up at him with roomy eyes as if to say, "Of course you did." The next morning dawned with a sense of purpose Thomas hadn't felt in years. His day off stretched before him, and he knew exactly how he wanted to spend it. After a quick breakfast, he drove to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where Linda Parker had been caring for the Bobcat kitten. The center, situated on 20 acres of woodland outside Conway, consisted of a main building, flanked by various enclosures and outbuildings Thomas had visited before, usually dropping off injured animals found during his patrols, but had never stayed long. Linda met him at the entrance, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hands encased in latex gloves. "Thomas," Jane said, "you might stop by. Come on back." She led him through the main treatment area where various wildlife, a barred owl with an injured wing, a porcupine recovering from an encounter with a car, 2 orphan raccoons were being tended by volunteers. "How's our little friend doing?" Thomas asked, following Linda into a quieter back room. Linda's face broke into a smile. "Much better than expected. She's a fighter." She gestured to a small incubator where the Bobcat kitten lay on a heated pad and 4-line, delivering fluids. The kitten looked marginally better than the day before, her eyes more alert, though she remained worryingly still. "Has she eaten anything?" "A little bit of special formula." "Not enough, but it's progressed." Linda checked the 4 and adjusted the temperature settings. The research team called this morning. This is indeed one of their study subjects' offspring they've been tracking. The mother for 18 months. She's known as BF42 in their records. Thomas moved closer to the incubator, mesmerized by the tiny wild cat. "Do they know anything that might help?" Linda nodded. "They've observed her several times over the past month. According to their field notes, she had 5 kittens initially, which is extremely unusual for bobcats. Normally, they have 2 or 3. 5 would put enormous strain on her ability to nurse them all adequately." 5, Thomas repeated, brow furrowing. "I only saw 4 yesterday. The 3 she took with her, and this little one." A troubled expression crossed Linda's face. "That's what concerns me. If there was a 5th kitten, Thomas didn't need her." To finish the thought, "Somewhere out there could be another abandoned kitten, even weaker than this one." "I'm going back," he said decisively. "If there's another one out there, we need to find it." Linda placed a hand on his arm. "Thomas, the chances of finding another kitten after all this time, and even if you do, I have to try," he said simply. After getting directions to the research team's last known sighting locations, Thomas drove back to Breton Woods. The day had turned overcast, a light drizzle making the forest glisten. He parked in the same spot as the day before and stood for a moment studying the surrounding woods. If he were a mother bobcat with hungry kittens, where would he den? Somewhere sheltered near water with good visibility of approaching predators. Thomas set off into the forest, following a faint game trail that paralleled the road for about a/4 mile before curving deeper into the trees. For 2 hours, Thomas searched methodically, drawing on all his outdoors experience. The rain intensified, soaking through his jacket, but he pressed on just as he was. Considering turning back, a sound caught his attention, so faint he almost missed it over the patter of rain. Following the noise, Thomas pushed through a dense thicket and found himself in a small clearing. There beside a fallen log lay a tiny bobcat kitten, even smaller than the one he'd rescued yesterday. It mewed weakly, its fur sodden from the rain, eyes barely open. "I'll be damned," Thomas whispered, heart pounding. "You're a survivor, aren't you?" Moving with gentle urgency, he removed his outer shirt, now relatively dry, and carefully wrapped the kitten. It was alarmingly cold to the touch and offered no resistance whatsoever. The hike back to his car seemed interminable. Rain had turned the forest floor slick, and Thomas moved cautiously, one arm cradling the precious bundle against his chest, the other helping him navigate the increasingly treacherous terrain. By the Time he reached his cruiser, both he and the kitten were thoroughly soaked despite his best efforts cranking the heat to maximum. Thomas placed the bundle on the passenger seat and immediately called. "Linda, I found another one," he said without preamble. "Much worse condition than yesterday's. I'm headed your way now. I'll be ready," Linda replied, the professional calm in her voice belied by its urgency. "Drive safely, Thomas. That little life depends on it." The 40-minute drive to the rehabilitation center was nerve-wracking. Every few minutes Thomas would glance over at the tiny bundle, relieved each time he saw the slight movement indicating the kitten was still breathing. Once, when he had to brake suddenly for a deer crossing the road, he instinctively put his arm out to protect the kitten, a gesture that would have made Margaret smile. Linda was waiting outside when he pulled up, a towel line carrier ready. With practiced efficiency, she transferred the kitten and rushed it inside, Thomas following close. Behind what followed was a flurry of activity, warming the hypothermic kitten, administering fluids, checking vital signs. Thomas stood back, aware he was out of his depth, but unwilling to leave after what seemed an eternity. Linda stepped back from the treatment table, peeling off her gloves. "She's stabilized," she announced, her expression serious but not defeated. "It's touch and go, but she's got a chance. You found her just in time, Thomas." The relief was so profound that Thomas had to sit down, suddenly aware of his own sodden state and the exhaustion of the day's search. Here, Linda tossed him a spare sweatshirt from a nearby closet. "Get yourself dried off before you catch pneumonia." Coffees in the break room. Once somewhat restored with dry clothes and hot coffee, Thomas found himself drawn back to the room where both Bobcat kittens now rested in adjacent incubators. The first kitten, whom Linda had started calling Hope, looked markedly improved from that morning. The second, now dubbed Faith, remained critical but had already shown small signs of improvement. "Two little miracles," Linda said, joining him. "It's not often we get happy endings like this in wildlife rehab." Thomas nodded, watching the rise and fall of their tiny chests. "What happens to them? Now we'll raise them here until they're strong enough for soft release. Probably this fall they'll need to learn hunting skills, avoid humans, all the things their mother would have taught them." She glanced at Thomas. "It's a long road ahead. I'd like to help," Thomas said, surprising himself with the offer. "Whatever you need." Linda studied him thoughtfully. "You know, we could use another volunteer for weekend feedings. The hours are terrible and the pay is non-existent." Thomas chuckled. "Sounds perfect." And so began a new chapter in Thomas Owens's life. Twice a week, he would stop by the rehabilitation center. Before or after his shifts, initially his visits were focused entirely on the Bobcat kittens, watching their remarkable progress with a sense of investment he hadn't felt in years. Hope and Faith graduated from incubators to a small indoor enclosure, then to a larger outdoor space designed to introduce them to their natural environment while keeping them safe. As the weeks passed, Thomas's involvement expanded. He found himself helping with other animals, repairing enclosures, even assisting with educational programs for local schools. The volunteers, mostly retirees and college students, welcomed him warmly, and Thomas discovered a community he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening in late July, Thomas arrived at the center to find Linda bubbling with excitement. The research team spotted the mother Bobcat and her 3 kittens this morning, she announced, all healthy and thriving. They're denning about 3 miles from where you found Faith. Thomas felt a rush of satisfaction. That's great news. So she made the right call. Difficult as it was, Linda nodded. In the wild, difficult decisions are made for survival. She couldn't save all 5, but thanks to her and you, all 5 will have a chance at life. By September, Hope and Faith had transformed from the fragile creatures Thomas had rescued into sleek, energetic young bobcats with distinct personalities. Hope was bold and curious, often the first to investigate new objects in their enclosure. Faith remained more cautious but displayed remarkable climbing abilities, often perching on the highest branches to survey her domain. As their release date approached, Thomas felt a surprising mixture of pride and melancholy he had known from the beginning that the goal was always to return them to the wild, yet the prospect of saying goodbye was unexpectedly difficult. The day of the release dawned clear and cool, the mountains ablaze with autumn colors. The location had been carefully chosen, a secluded valley within the Bobcats' natural range, but far enough from the mother's territory to avoid conflict. The release would be soft. A temporary enclosure had been built on site, allowing the young Bobcats to acclimate to their new surroundings before the doors were opened and they could leave. At their own pace, Thomas helped transport the crates containing hope and faith to the site, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the emotion welling in his chest. Linda, sensing his mood, squeezed his shoulder. "This is the hardest part of the job," she said softly, "but also the most rewarding. The release itself was anticlimactic. The crates were placed inside. The temporary enclosure doors opened, and then the humans retreated to watch from a distance. Hope emerged first, as expected, cautiously exploring the enclosure before climbing a small tree to get a better view. Faith followed more slowly, staying close to the familiar crate initially before curiosity overcame caution. For an hour, Thomas watched through binoculars as the Bobcats explored their new temporary home they would remain in. The enclosure for 2 weeks, with volunteers providing food that would gradually decrease as the Bobcats learned to hunt on their own. After that, the enclosure door would be opened, allowing them to leave when ready, while still having a safe place to return if needed. As the team packed up to leave, Linda handed Thomas a small gift bag, a little something to remember them by. Inside was a framed photograph of Thomas sitting between the 2 incubators on that first day, his expression a mixture of concern and hope. Beneath the photo, a simple inscription: "Every creature deserves a chance." Thomas swallowed hard. Margaret used to say that. Linda smiled. "Great minds think alike." In the months that followed, Thomas continued his volunteer work at the rehabilitation center while maintaining his duties as a state trooper. Occasionally, the research team would send updates about Hope and Faith, who had successfully adapted to life in the wild. Trail cameras had captured images of them hunting, exploring, and even interacting briefly with other Bobcats from a distance. When winter settled over the White Mountains, Thomas found himself driving the same stretch of Route 302 where his adventure had begun, slowing near the spot where he'd first encountered the mother Bobcat. He pulled over, cut the engine, and simply sat watching the snow-covered forest. No Bobcats appeared, of course. They were elusive by nature, especially in winter. But Thomas knew they were out there. Hope and Faith, their mother and siblings, and countless other wild creatures making their way in a world that was often harsh but occasionally kind. As he prepared to pull back onto the road, Thomas noticed movement in his rear-view mirror. NH Fish and game truck had pulled up behind him, and Jane Martinez was walking toward his window. "Knew it had to be you when I saw the cruiser," she said as he rolled down the window. "Everything okay?" Thomas smiled, just taking a moment to remember. "Any word on our Bobcat friends?" Jane's face lit up. "Funny you should ask. The research team recorded something pretty remarkable last week. They've got trail cameras all through this area, and one of them captured images of Hope and Faith still together, which is unusual in itself for juvenile Bobcats crossing paths with their mother and one of their siblings." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Seriously, did they recognize each other?" "Hard to say for sure, but the footage shows them in the same clearing for nearly 10 minutes. No aggression, which is significant. The researchers are beside themselves. This kind of family interaction isn't well documented in Bobcats, especially after such a separation." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest. Despite the winter chill, nature's full of surprises. "Indeed it is," Jane agreed, "just like state troopers who can't resist playing wildlife hero." She said it with a smile that took any sting from the words. "Someone has to keep you fish and game folks busy," Thomas retorted with a chuckle as Jane headed back to her truck. With a wave, Thomas took one last look at the forest before pulling back onto the road. The Bobcat family story had changed him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. That spring morning when the call came through, it had opened a door to a part Of himself, he'd closed off after Margaret's death the part that could care deeply, take risks, and find joy in unexpected places. Somewhere in those woods, two young bobcats were forging their path in the world, survivors against the odds, connected forever to each other and to the unlikely human who had given them a second chance. And in his own way, Thomas too had been given a second chance at purpose, at community, at the simple joy of making a difference. As he drove away, Thomas could almost hear Margaret's voice on the wind. Every creature has a story. We just need to be quiet enough to hear it. And sometimes, he thought with a smile, brave enough to become part of it.